Okay, and so good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I see we're going live and we've got people joining. So as we're joining, let me just give you a quick introduction. So our webinar this afternoon is on unlocking the secrets to workplace equity. And we are joined today by Anita Lettink, who is a leading expert on the future of work and emerging technologies and author of Equal Pay for Equal Work. Now, Anita will be chatting to Cornerstone Hicks about pay transparency and the steps you can take to get there now. If you are new to this webinar tool, I do want to draw your attention to the Q&A functionality, which should be in front of you, and the chat tool. So do feel free to comment, ask questions, and get involved in the conversation as we are going through. So what I will do now is just draw your attention also to the poll that's currently live on screen. So I'm hoping if I share that to the screen, you guys should then start being able to vote as the guys are introducing themselves. So passing over to Anita and Luke to just introduce themselves.
Hey everyone, over to you, Anita.
Hi everyone, my name is Anita Lettink. I live in the Netherlands. I have been in the HR and payroll industry for about 25 years, mostly from a technology perspective. I worked with a lot of large international companies, and since the start of the pandemic, I have been working as an independent. I spend about 50% of my time on keynotes, and the other 50% I work with companies, large and small, to figure out what type of solutions they need to bring the future of work closer to their employees. And last year, I wrote a book about equal pay for equal work, which we are going to discuss today. Over to you, Luke.
Thanks, Anita. So yeah, hello everybody. I'm delighted to join you this afternoon, straight after lunch. I've been in the HR technology space for about 15 years. I actually worked with Anita many years ago, but she's forgotten.
You did, yes.
But pay transparency is something that's really topical right now, both for me personally and for the industry. I've been a people leader at Cornerstone for the last couple of years, and we introduced our own pay transparency process recently. But the more and more conversations I have with HR, both in local UK entities and in their global functions, pay transparency is really key. And so I'm super excited about having this conversation with Anita today to get her viewpoint and also share some insights from what Cornerstone's been doing. So Anita, why don't we kick it off with all this conversation around pay transparency right now and some legislation that's changing in different territories around the world. You've obviously written this pretty awesome book, Equal Pay for Equal Work. Why is this suddenly such a hot topic? What is happening and why did you write this book?
Yeah, it's a really good question to start with, because the interesting thing is that equal pay for equal work legislation isn't new. It has been around for probably half a century. And we shouldn't be looking at the pay gap at this point in time, not at gender pay gaps, not at age pay gaps, but we do. If you look at the European Union, the average pay gap at this point in time is 13%. This is the gender pay gap, so between men and women. And so it's obvious that somewhere along the line, something has gone wrong or maybe not landed quite well, but we are still looking at unequal pay between men and women for the same roles. And I think that governments have taken an interest to understand, why does this legislation not work and what are we going to do now? And that all culminated in the European Pay Transparency Directive that was introduced last year, or actually that the European Parliament had been working on for 2 years, but it was approved last year. It was signed by Ursula von der Leyen in June of 2023. And that means that we're now slowly getting to implementation. But apart from the fact that this is pretty soon the law, there's also a trend towards more transparency. And the fact that employees feel that they don't have good insights into what they should ask for when they join a company. Because when you read a vacancy and you start to apply for that role, you really have no idea what an appropriate salary for that role is at that particular company, because they could pay above market rates, it could pay under market rates. And so you don't know until later on in the process, when they actually offer you the job, or maybe you asked about pay, but when they offer you the job, then you know what you will earn. And younger generation, especially young people, I work with a lot of young people at the university where I'm involved, and they think that that is really strange. Why would you apply for a job to earn money when you don't even know what you are going to earn? So slowly but surely, what we see is that more and more companies are starting to advertise salary ranges in their vacancies. Also because that is more and more the law in many jurisdictions. And so this whole process is actually going a little bit faster than the rollout of the directive, but more transparency towards what people earn and what people will get in compensation is certainly the trend.
I think, Anita, that's a good point on the hiring process. And I think talent acquisition teams probably will feel more comfortable with sharing more transparent salary ranges, because whilst you're right, at the entry point, when you've got young people, ambitious people looking to take a job primarily for compensation, it also impacts the other end, where you've got experienced people playing for roles who are engaged with the company, but they just get a system generated, unfortunately, you've been successful message. And often that's because they're above the salary range.
Yeah.
The recruiter doesn't take time to share that. And so it knocks their confidence. They think perhaps they're not a fit or they don't have suitable capability. But the truth is they're just too expensive. So I think that has huge benefits for talent acquisition. Legislation changes always focuses the mind and accelerates our behavior. But what exactly do businesses need to be preparing for right now? You know, I see that salaries are starting to come in bands, like you say, on vacancies. But is that enough, or do organizations do they need to implement more structure and do more around education within their business to make this work effectively?
Yeah, they will need to do a lot more. And that is also why we're having this conversation today, because doing a lot more takes a lot of time, obviously. And I think one of the reasons why we are still looking at this pay gap, and the reason why it's still at 13%, is that there's really nothing that forces company to look at this and to repair it other than an employee taking an employer to court. And that is really difficult, because then you have to prove that you actually did equal work and that you were paid less. So in future, one of the requirements of the European directive is that, first of all, you always have to publish salary bands in vacancies. The second thing is that during the hiring process, you cannot ask that person what they earn today. And so that means you cannot base your salary proposal on how much they earn today, even if that would be considerably less than the rest of your workforce. You have to give them a proposal that is based on your compensation philosophy. And so that will already take away some of the gaps, because we know that one of the reasons why the gap is so persistent is because people have this, businesses have ask, what do you currently make? And then they give you like 100 or 200 euros more to convince you to come work for them. So that is one. The second thing that companies need to do is they need to become much more open about what your pay is, how they determine that compensation or your total compensation, but also what is available as you progress through your career. So what kind of steps can you make to start earning more in future? And what is also super important is that employees will have the right to information. So the reporting, the obligatory reporting that companies need to do on their gender pay gap is public. And every employee can ask for that report. And employees can also ask for a more personalized version of that report to understand where they are in comparison to their peers. Now, that does not mean that you have to put the salaries of everyone that works for you on the board. That's not the case. But you will, for instance, need to divide your salary bands in 4 quartiles and then tell your employee, well, you sit here and the other people in your team or in the role that is equal to you sit there. And so people can evaluate where they are. Now, if the reporting turns out or it reveals that the gap is 5% or larger, then companies will have to repair that. If they don't, unions, works councils, but also the employee themselves have the right to ask for an assessment. And part of that assessment is that the gap needs to be closed to the bandwidth of plus or minus 5%. And if companies refuse to do that, you can take them to court, but instead of how it is now, where the burden of proof is on the employee, the burden of proof shifts to the employer, and they need to prove that they did not pay you less than your peers who do equal work. And companies who fail to adhere to all these policies will also be subject to fines. We don't yet know what those fines are, but we suspect or expect that they will be in the vicinity of what is currently standard for the GDPR, so a percentage of revenue. So a lot of change coming towards us.
Anita, there was one thing you said there that I think is a real seismic shift, and you said the ability to ask the candidate what their current pay is will be taken away. And I sit here and, as a hiring manager myself and people leaders, see how often we're hiring new team members, and I see their interaction with our talent acquisition team. And understanding their pay feels like a really crucial part of the conversation. And as you know, Cornerstone's introduced our own pay transparency process, or really a new philosophy to promote equitable pay. But one of the things that kind of locks horns with is budgets. So whilst we have salary and pay rate, as a leader, you also have a team budget. And so whilst the range might suggest that the top end can pay them X, it doesn't mean that I have it in my budget. And the pressure is on me to perform, and to perform with the right skills and capabilities. And what we're introducing there is taking away the right to negotiate, which, as someone who spent a career in sales, that feels almost unnatural to me, to not be able to have negotiation conversations.
Yeah, I know that, and I hear that a lot from people that start to implement this. But the flip side of it is that later on it gets easier. Conversations with potential candidates are not such negotiation tactics or procedures, simply because you have a bandwidth that you can offer to prospective employees. And if they don't fit within that bandwidth, then you could hire them, but that would upset what you already have for your current employees. And there you might need to do some adjustments there, and companies typically don't want that. Now, the other side of the coin is, we talked about this earlier, salary bands in vacancies. What we have seen from research is that companies actually get more qualified candidates on these apply to these vacancies, simply because by using the salary bands, people self-select out. So they see what they currently make, they understand what kind of salary or compensation is available for this role, and based on that, they make an informed decision: is this for me, or is this not for me? And therefore, the quality of the candidates go up, which is good for everyone, because 1,000 applicants to a vacancy is unsustainable, right? And you just mentioned that Cornerstone discloses salary information in vacancies, and you talked a little bit about that. But what I'm curious to find out what your experience with pay
Yeah.
transparency in Cornerstone is, and where you were at.
Yeah, well, I feel pretty lucky because listening to you, I think Cornerstone has a degree of maturity here. And as a talent management organization, you would expect us to be. But halfway through last year, we introduced more than just pay transparency, but a new philosophy to promote equitable pay. And we wanted to do this for a number of reasons, but really it was focused on, if you go back, Anita, I remember the times when we used to talk about a merit increase. And I quite like that language, because I think there's a fear sometimes today that if we try and implement too much infrastructure to drive diversity, which we all want, is that you can step away from a meritocracy. And what Cornerstone absolutely want to hold on to is that meritocracy concept when we go through this. So we've introduced pay transparency. And as you just said, soon it will be law for everyone to be able to go and access a report. We make it available within our own HCM platform. So any employee from day one to the day they leave can go straight online into our HR platform and pull the report for every role within our organization and look at the pay ranges based on geo-specific expertise, etc. But the way we structure those pay ranges are really based on three factors. So experience, of course, how much experience you bring from domain expertise and into that particular role. The skills that you have, and I would say the skills is kind of becoming the foundation for pay at Cornerstone. In the past, we've obviously had things like capability models, competency frameworks. Skills is becoming that new currency, and we make skills a core part of every conversation. What skills do you bring to this role and to our organization? And then the final is more specific to your performance in role. So your pay going forward is based on how you're performing in that role based on a number of key measures. And what we've tried to do is, and to give you the context of Cornerstone as well, which is probably helpful. So we have 4,000 employees. We are just over $1 billion in revenue, and we have offices in around 26 countries. And in the last 2 years, we've made 5 or 6 acquisitions. So you can imagine how diverse we are in different conditions, different cultures, different pay ranges. And so there's a degree of mediation we have to bring all of that together. But what we're trying to achieve in doing so is not just being conscious of the legislation, but having transparent, equitable, performance-based pay, but that's globally consistent, but also locally conscious. We recognize that pay demands in New York are different to that in London, and London is different to Asia Pacific and so on. So we want this to remain market dynamic and scalable. Anything could happen. New competitors could enter our market in London, which drives up salaries, and we have to be able to react to that. To get to this point, we obviously had to merge different terms and conditions. We had to look at different pay cultures within some of the acquired companies, which creates some challenges. But we also took expertise externally. So we went out to benchmarking organizations, and we started to assess what the market rate was based on organizations that are also in the SaaS space, so software as a service. They have a similar revenue size to us, so we're the same sort of scale of company, but also match the kind of functional level of individual that you'd be employed in our organization, so that we can define really clear salary ranges for role based on skills, experience, and performance. And we are 6 to 9 months into that process. January is the first month of our new financial year, so we do most of our hiring, and now as a manager where I start to see the impact that has. For example, I lead quite an ambitious growing team who have started early in their career and they're moving. They're forever looking at salary ranges and assuming that if they're in that role, they should, of course, demand the top of the range. And that's not the case, because you need to acquire the experience, the skills. But also, Anita, for transparency, I don't always have the budget to pay the top of that range. So sometimes the salary range and organizational budget is at loggerheads. Yeah. Does that make any sense? And
it makes a lot of sense. And I think it's super interesting to hear the experiences of someone that is going through all these changes, especially because a lot of companies they still have to take the first step. They've just heard about this and they are now starting to prepare themselves. So thank you.
And on that theme of preparation, obviously Cornerstone's a little bit further ahead of the curve than most people I would expect to us sitting on this call. But from a practical perspective, if you've done nothing on pay transparency today, what should you start to do in order to prepare for the new EU directive? And when's the first report due? So if you're thinking about implementing process today and big readiness, what should we be doing right now?
Yeah, and I'm going to ask Yvonne to flip up the slide that I created to help people understand what needs to be done. But the first report is due in 2027, and this is for companies in Europe with 150 employees or more. And then the largest companies will have to report every year, and the smaller companies will have to report every 3 years. But even though 2027 seems very far away, the data you have to use is of 2026, which means that really, if you want your first report to be good, you have 2 more years to get those done. And that means that you need to think about a couple of steps that you can take to prepare yourself. First of all, you need to determine your compensation philosophy. In objective criteria, what do you pay for? You just talked about location. Location can be a variant in pay. If you live in New York, obviously you pay, how your living costs are a lot higher than if you live in a country like Spain or Portugal. And your compensation philosophy should reflect if you pay for location or if you don't. You could also pay for education. You might pay for tenure or skills, but it needs to be very clear to your employees, what exactly do you pay for?
Anita, sorry to stop you in the flow there, but location is one that I sort of challenge our internal HR and talent.
Okay.
And the reason being is that post-pandemic, obviously, we sort of went through 50 years of evolution over 18 months in the pandemic. But location has become so much more subjective because almost no progressive organization, unless you have to physically be there to do the doing, demands that you're in one place of work every day. And that means that, I have younger team members that will drift from one Airbnb for one quarter to another quarter, and they can work solely remotely. My office is in London, but I live 2 hours north and commute in and out regularly. And so that's something that I think we're kind of challenging the status quo because of the impact on remote working. And so whilst there's regionalization at a macro level, it's starting to be challenged. Would you agree with that?
Well, no. And for the simple reason that, yes, obviously for people like you and me, location isn't an issue and we should not be paid based on location, probably. But the reality is that 80% of the workforce is location based. And so going forward, location will definitely remain part of compensation philosophies, even if it's to say everyone works in the same location, so we do not pay based on location. That can also, like if you work in a hospital, everyone comes to that hospital, so location-based pay is not a factor. So it depends very much on what kind of work you do, but it is, because it's such a topic of debate, I always recommend that people put it in, so there's no room for error on this. All right, so compensation philosophy, and I know it's a hot topic, and you can put a lot of it in, you can leave a lot of it out, but make sure that it fits that's fit for purpose for your company. And then you need to decide what you are going to measure first, because the European Pay Directive determines that you have to measure the compensation gap, so that you need to monetize everything that you give an employee, from salaries to benefits, and measure that gap. But before you start doing that, and you probably cannot do that in the first go, I would suggest that you start by measuring salaries. Just start to look at salaries, because this is new and you need to build up some experience with what you are doing, what you are seeing, how you can explain differences. And the easiest thing to do that is to standardize on salaries. So that is number one. Then the second thing that you need to do is group employees that perform similar or equal work, and don't make that definition too tight, because I've already seen some companies that ended up with separate job descriptions for almost everyone that worked there. That is not the purpose of all of this. Ultimately, you will have to report over quartiles. So you will have 4 brackets of functions that you will report the numbers on, but make sure that your groups are large enough so that you can actually compare people who are doing equal jobs. And there are a number of ways that you can actually do this. The most common way to do this is a point-based factor, which means that a function has 100 points, and then you assign points to that function based on, for instance, experience, skills, responsibilities, and so on. And you come to a certain number, and all the roles in that number fall in the same brackets. So once you have done that, so you're measuring salaries, you've grouped employees, I would recommend that you start measuring right away, simply because you probably have not done this before and you need a little bit of experience to understand how to interpret the results. Now, there are a number of solutions called tech equity solutions that can help you with this evaluation. They also contain statistical analysis methods so that you can quickly see, for instance, what roles are more commonly high paid, which roles are more commonly low paid, how does that correspond to the gender pay gap? Is there a gender pay gap? Are we maybe looking at an age gap or another gap? But you need to understand quickly what you are looking at so that you can determine the unadjusted pay gap. And why am I calling this the unadjusted pay gap? Because the first report that you get is not, or you don't yet know exactly what you are looking at. So you need to start looking at the outliers that you see, people that are far above the others, people that are far below the others. Both are possible. And maybe the explanation is very simple. They don't have the qualifications that other team members have, or maybe outliers have gotten a number of performance-based merit increases that the others didn't get. But you have to know the explanation so that you can bring down the gap and determine if there really is a gap. And so once you have done that, you are looking at the adjusted gap. And the adjusted gap is really what we are after. We need to understand if the adjusted gap is more or less than 5%. And then we can start to look at, okay, what do we need to do now to bridge that gap? Because the longer you wait to bridge the gap, the more costlier it becomes. Remember that salary increases are often in percentage. So if you already have a percentage that is higher, then with the next increase, it only becomes higher and the gap becomes larger. And then you have to choose with your management what you are going to do. Are you going to pay people a little bit more in the coming 2 years so that by 2027, you can report over data that is more or less in line with what you should expect and you hardly have a gap? Or is your first pay report going to show that you have a gap? And I think that's going to be a really difficult conversation with employees, but that is also dependent on how your company is doing. Do you have the budget to bridge these gaps? So you still have 2 years, and it seems like a long time, but in fact, it is a little bit short. It's not a lot of time if your gaps are large.
Anita, that was a great explanation. If it's okay with you, I'll come back with a couple of observations and questions while we're on this slide. The first thing I kind of heard there is that you need really good data. So, that old adage, you can't manage what you don't measure. 2 years does sound like a long time, but if you don't have great capability data, great pay data, great people roles and job framework, job family data, then you have a lot to do even to start the measuring it. The other thing that I kind of heard loud and clear is this is something you probably need strategic alignment with from the office of the CFO, either the CFO themselves or at least from the supporting function in finance, because there is a good chance that if you haven't looked at this professionally before, and particularly if you've scaled as an organization, either through acquisition or entrepreneurially, you probably do have, one job title for every two or three roles that you have, which causes lots and lots of pain. And you're potentially going to find some gaps, which is going to leave financial exposure that you're going to need to right size somehow. So you need strategic support, I'm guessing, from the CHRO and the CFO. Would that be sort of a wise approach?
That is a very accurate observation. What I always advise HR departments that I work with to do right away is go to the board and present on what you are doing, because this is a meticulous conversation. This is about money. Everyone is affected. And if you are not very careful, this can very quickly derail into all kinds of assumptions in your workforce that you don't want to deal with. So parallel to this, you need to start talking to your board, and you need to start educating your business leaders, because ultimately they are the ones that are going to talk to groups of employees. Like you mentioned, you're talking to your team, and it is very specific, and you need to be very precise when you talk about money and compensation.
Do you think most organizations have healthy enough data across their technology to be able to paint the picture quite quickly, or do you think that's something that they often need to invest in to get to a point of, real accuracy and objectiveness when making decisions around the new pay philosophy that they'll implement?
Yeah, that is why I split salary from compensation, because I believe that most organizations do have correct salary data. There might be some errors, but overall the quality is usually good. But it's much harder to get access or to combine that with compensation data, because that is often managed in different solutions. And so you don't have everything in your salary solution. And to access that data and to make sure it's correct for everyone is a lot harder than just starting to look at salary, get some experience in how to evaluate all that data, and then later in a later stage or in a second stage add compensation and do the same thing.
My kind of final observation is that this feels like a great time for organizations to reevaluate what performance-related pay should look like, or what has a compensation value in the organization. So perhaps you did a pay evaluation several years ago, but the world has changed a lot post-pandemic. And perhaps the skills you need today, the capabilities that you need today, the expertise that you valued 5 years ago is not necessarily the skills and capability that gets you into your next evolution of the company. Do you think that that is the right opportunity to take that 2 years and sit down and not just look at the core data that you've got and how you would sit people into pay ranges fairly today and equitably, but to reevaluate what higher compensation should be built upon?
Yeah, I absolutely think this is an opportunity to also look at some other parts of your HR structure, because what we know from job descriptions is that they're usually out of date. Right? They're written when you were hired or maybe in a position. You look at them when you apply for the role, but then a week or maybe a month after you're actually in that role, that job description already doesn't apply anymore. And going forward, we also know that most companies will adopt a more skills-based approach. So if that is what you are planning and you don't have yet, I would say there is still enough time to change that. So make the switch from these long, these pages of job descriptions to shorter overviews of experience and skill sets, and then use that as a base to start measuring equal pay. And what companies that have a little bit more time also often do is use this project to benchmark themselves against the competition or in the industry, just to understand if they pay above market or at market, And also to remain competitive in the job market, because going forward, you will have to publish salary bands in vacancies. And if they are not what the market expects, then obviously you will not have any or candidates, or maybe a lot less candidates that you would hope.
I personally see that a lot in the conversations I have with HR. So what you just described there is 10 years ago, we relied really heavily on competency frameworks and job families, and they were never maintained at the pace in which the business changed.
Yeah.
So they weren't dynamic. And so we definitely see this shift with organizations moving away to what we would call a simple skills taxonomy rather than a competency framework, which is just too hard to keep up with. And even this week, actually, I was aware of a conversation we were having with a retailer. They have about 4,000 employees, nearly 200 stores. And they had a CFO sponsored project, which was to look at compensation or increased compensation based on the skills that they know leads to successful conversations with their customers in their stores. And it's a really sort of modern way of thinking that you just wouldn't have come across in the past, because we would have thought about the competence of the role rather than the skills of the individual. And I think that's been a bit of a shift. I don't know if you want to move away from this now, Anita, and perhaps talk a little bit more about some of your learnings throughout this process, or perhaps even back to me and sharing some of the things that I'm still learning as Cornerstone go through our own pay transparency.
Yeah, let me give you one or two, and then maybe you can give me one or two. I'm curious to hear what you have learned. So one of the observations that I have made is that you can do this for companies of any size. I often hear from companies that they're reluctant to do this simply because they have less than 100 employees. And if you do this, everyone will know everyone else's salaries. As long as you keep the groups large enough, let's say 10 people, then you can definitely do this. And when I wrote the book, I also talked to a number of CHROs that had done this for 50 or 60 employee companies. So size really is not a barrier in getting this done. And I think the second lesson learned is that even though this is called pay transparency, that does not mean that you have to put the salaries of every individual employee on the board. There are levels in pay transparency, and one of the the level I think that most companies will arrive at is that they will be completely transparent about their compensation philosophy, about their salary bands, and about salary progression. But they might not go as far as disclosing everyone's individual compensation, but stop at, okay, so within this salary range, we have 50 employees, and then they're spread over the quartiles of this salary band in the following fashion. And you can look at the salary band and understand where you are, and also based on requirements, know what you need to do to get to the next next step, or maybe to a different band. Now I'm curious about your lessons learned.
Yeah, look, I'm only a people manager, so I don't see this from the top level down. My operational challenges are kind of what I described before. But let's start with the positives. First of all, I think that this is an employee engagement piece as well. I think that when you give really clear transparency and objective structure to why you're being paid that amount, the focus is on what you offer to the organization in return for the salary, rather than how much you're being paid and how much your peers are being paid. So I think you build a confidence in the workforce where you be super transparent. The challenges it creates for me, as I talked about, is I have a super ambitious, younger team who all want to kick on, and they'll look at their role and look at the salary range, and Cornerstone keep those ranges quite broad. And I'll come on to how we break those down in a moment. You've heard me talk a little bit about experience, skills, and performance. But the issue we have is we may have some people that sit at the top of that salary range within the team, and I'm hiring, but my budget today doesn't allow me to afford the top of that range. And that's an organizational challenge. And I don't really know how I overcome that as a people leader, because what's in the pot is what's in the pot. So I'll let you kind of comment in a moment on what your view is on that. You also, through acquisition, can sometimes inherit people who are perhaps under the range, which is a nicer thing to find, because then you can do an evaluation, find out if they meet the skills and requirements for the role, and if they are, you can right size that. Where perhaps the challenges come in is if you find someone that's above the range. And if they're above the range, then again, it's a skills assessment and to see if there's ambition to move into a slightly different role that has other compensation. If they don't, then that's where I need the support of HR and talent about whether there's perhaps a one-time salary payment that allows us to reduce their salary. But it becomes a really difficult conversation. Yeah, I think that's. I'm just trying to think about my recent experience with this in terms of right sizing and looking at alternative roles. But I think largely that's the complexity, is that the range of the role doesn't always meet the budget that the need is being given. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Anita.
Well, I think so. You're absolutely correct, and I hear you. But I would say that from my experience as a people leader, the budget is never enough. You always want a little bit more because you have some outliers or some people that are performing really well, and you want to pay them more. So there's always budget constraints in companies, and that does not change. I think it becomes a little bit more formal, but you are never able to pay everyone what you want them to receive. And I have also had in the past occasions where I wanted to hire someone, but we simply couldn't justify the budget because they were so much more expensive than other people in the team, and we did not want to do that. And so ultimately we didn't hire them. I think what is important to say, in addition to people that are above the salary band, so they're in a role, and let's say the salary band stops at 50,000 euros, but you find out that they earn 55. And it's super important in communication to always stress that no one will earn less. So you cannot take money away from people so that they fit back in the salary band. But what you can do is, if that person, like you mentioned, is not interested in a promotion, and so they remain in the current role and the salary band does not reach these 55,000 euros that they currently get, then there's simply no increases for them until the salary band is adjusted. That's also not a policy that is strictly new for pay transparency. Companies that I've worked for already applied that even before pay transparency. If you're outside of the range, that is where you stay until the range catches up with you, or you apply to a role that is more fitting for what you're getting paid.
That's good advice. The one thing it helps team leaders and people managers do is be super objective in performance-based pay. So, we really believe at Cornerstone that we're in a skills-based economy, and that means that skills are generally the currency of our growth. So we can be really prescriptive in the way that we explain to our employees what skills they need to demonstrate to get those next salary and compensation bands. You also mentioned, Anita, about not wanting to have hundreds and hundreds of roles, particularly in relation to the size of your organization. My team often deals with businesses that have less than 5,000 employees, and you would not be surprised how often they have more than 1,000 job roles.
Oh yeah.
And I think you find that in entrepreneurial organizations that are scaling up, because they try to be creative to find ways to bring in innovative skills and experiences and pay them relatively. The one go-between that I think I found can work is bringing back gradings of roles. So you could be an account executive or a solution consulting, but you could be grade 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5.
Yes.
And whilst that increases a little bit of complexity, I think as long as you can align the skills and experiences to those grades, it does give both the employee a very linear and obvious way to salary progress. It allows you to have a little bit more agility in how you manage the team for different experiences levels.
Yeah, I think that's the only way to do this, because you cannot if you have 4,000 or 5,000 people and you have 1,000 job descriptions or that's a lot. It's also a lot to maintain, right? So you just talked about the fact that you work with other companies. So I'm also curious to learn how Cornerstone supports customers that are preparing for this program.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thanks for asking that, Anita. So, Cornerstone, in its very DNA, is a talent management technology company, which is a little bit of a mouthful. What it means is that we kind of we impact every part of the employee experience that you would consider strategic in their development, their retention, or their progress. So, whether we're trying to attract you in the recruiting process and we're dealing with the offer and the onboarding exercise, or whether you're in role and you're learning to be a true SME in that role, or you're then perhaps looking at career pathways and what avenues you can take into your next role. All of that is managed within Cornerstone. So even the compensation cycle or the merit cycle. So we would look at your skills, the skills capability you have, your ambitions, the skills that you're looking to develop, the experiences, and what you're paid. And that would allow you to be quite prescriptive in coming to the organization saying, well, I can see that I'm an account executive today, but I'd really like to be a marketing director. And our software prescribes to them the right mentors they could be aligned to learn those skills, perhaps any gigs or short-term roles that they could take to develop some of those skills without being in a full-time permanent post. Any skills gaps that they have or learnings that they could be taking, and also shows them the compensation based on their current role and the compensation achievable for that role. So our software is designed for employees to come on a journey. We assume that when you start the organization, your career will go left or right, and you perhaps might end up in a role that's very different to the one that you joined. And we effectively give you the framework to be engaged in what that journey could look like and the most effective route for you to take it.
That's good to hear. I did so when I was at the session in London, I did see some examples of that, and I think it helps people understand what the opportunity is, and also to potentially pursue some career steps and better prepare themselves for that.
Absolutely. So, for example, whilst your ambition today might be to get higher compensation and your skills, experience, and current job range doesn't allow you to do that, what we would then say is, but we'll invest in you for a learning development mentorship, which will take you on a route to get to that compensation. So it makes it super clear and objective, and helps employees know where they are. There's nothing worse in today's workforce than an employee feels like the information or data points are hidden from them and they're working in the dark.
Exactly. So maybe it's time to ask Yvonne if there are any questions in the Q&A.
So I have a question, and it's just firstly for the audience before I come back on, is we do have a poll open. And I've got less than 50% of people have taken part in the poll, because my question will then be to Anita. So if possible, can anybody who hasn't already taken place in the poll, I've left it open throughout the webinar, if they could just pop onto the poll module and quickly answer. And then what I was going to ask Anita really was, what are your thoughts on these results as I share them on the screen? And hopefully they might change a little bit as a few more people take part.
I'm happy to see that no one has chosen not started yet. And I think the distribution of the other three is about what I would expect. So 20% project complete, 20% halfway there, and 60% just getting started. And I think that if you look at businesses across Europe, especially the somewhat smaller businesses, then just getting started is the reason why I wrote the book. Oh, we have one that has not started, but I hope after this webinar, they are quickly moving into just getting started, into the just getting started phase. Larger companies, and Luke, you've been talking about Cornerstone as a company, have already started to work on this. Companies in the UK, for instance, have been required to report on the gender pay gap since 2019. And that is, I would say, a a reason to look at this and really approach this in a professional way. In Europe, in mainland Europe, mandatory reporting has been limited to a few countries like Italy, and they have never enforced this reporting. There were no fines. So I think that a lot of companies did not even send in the report just because it wasn't necessary. That will change quickly. And even if companies are not ready to report yet, I would definitely recommend to start thinking about publishing your salary bands in vacancies, because that is something that we see more and more of. If you go on LinkedIn or Indeed or large vacancy sites, you see more salary bands in vacancies every day. I heard that in the United States, for instance, if you don't have a salary band in your vacancy, Indeed will publish a line that says similar functions for other companies pay this as a salary band, so that you still have the information even though that company hasn't published it. And that goes, I would say, full circle to the start of our conversation. It is becoming an expectation of candidates that they are informed before they start to respond to you. And, you know, they're right, because why is this such a secret? Why can you not know what you are being paid before you apply to a role? This is such an important, I mean, yes, there's also a fulfillment, but ultimately, I think that most of us also work for a paycheck, right? So it is important to know what that paycheck looks like before you hand in your application.
Great. And then I have a question off the back of that, I guess, is, so I know we've touched on sort of UK, we've touched on EU, GDPR, and all this stuff, the regulation coming in 2027. With the UK no longer in the EU, what kind of applies to us, and why do you think, I guess it's, why do you think we've put this webinar on today, even though we're based in the UK, but we're talking like broader Europe?
Simply because this will have ramifications throughout the world, or ripple effect throughout the world. European headquartered companies typically don't take measures just for their European population. And a lot of them are international, and they employ people around the world. So that means that if they shift towards more transparency around pay, career progression, and all of that, and use that to attract candidates. If you are trying to get candidates in a location where you're competing against European headquartered companies for these candidates, then you will have to go along with that. Otherwise, people will simply not come and work for you. And so it's also an expectation going forward set by this directive, but probably going to develop globally, that yes, of course, there's a salary band in a vacancy. And yes, of course, I know what my career progression and my salary progression can look like. And one final remark, we've been talking about the European Union a lot, but this is also happening in several states in the United States. It is in Australia, it's in New Zealand, it's in India. So for some reason, it is starting to develop all around the world.
Yeah, and let me just add a little bit to that as well, Yvonne, to give some context. So if you think about Cornerstone, so we're US headquartered, we're on the beach in Santa Monica, California. About probably 30% of our employees are in the UK, about 30% are in the EU, about 10% in the UK. But if you think, I mentioned earlier, Anita, that most of the organizations my team work with have less than 5,000 employees, almost exclusively they're global. So one of the days where you had like 500 employees and they were all in one village in the north of England, the new technology has allowed us to be flexible in where we hire people, and we hire the best people in the best location. And even when we see organizations that have 1,000 employees, they might have what we call a large head in the UK. The 40% of the employees are here, but 60% are spreading in another 10 or 15 countries across Europe and beyond. And so if you're a HR leader in the UK today, I'd be very surprised if this doesn't impact some or a large part of your workforce in other territories.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much to everybody for coming along today. I think we can sort of leave it there. We've been talking for almost an hour, and as we reach the top of the hour, let's say thanks to everybody for coming along, joining in. We hope you enjoyed the conversation today. What I didn't say at the start of the webinar is we did record, so I will send this around in the next week along with Anita's sort of top tips rather for getting started on this journey. So another thank you to Anita and thank you to Luke for coming along. I think this was a really informative conversation today, and I hope our audience agree. But with that, we'll say thank you so much to everybody and goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.